obviously the First World War, the Great War, was tremendously influential on Tolkien. And I certainly hope that readers would turn to John Garth's magnificent book, Tolkien and the Great War, for the sort of larger context of that. And looking at his spiritual experience in the war, which is what I was zeroing in on in these chapters. One of the most interesting things is that he comes through with his faith intact. And again, we mustn't take this for granted. It's very easy to take things for granted because that's how they happened. But, for instance, his friend C.S. Lewis went into the war as an atheist and came out as an atheist. Lewis's conversion to Christianity, came later. There were others, many Anglicans went into the war with, some level of faith and found that totally destroyed, coming out, rejecting their faith entirely. So we shouldn't take it as a given that Tolkien gets through the war with his faith intact, as in fact he does. And part of that, I think, we can usefully trace to his suffering as a boy, because he was an orphan by age 12, and he had to come to grips with that. And I think, again, we can trace the pastoral care of Father Francis and the other Oratorian fathers in helping him to process that, in helping him come to grips with the reality of suffering. And evidently he did. And one of the interesting things I looked at in researching this was actually some contemporary studies by Anglican chaplains and Catholic chaplains about the experiences of the soldiers in the war.
Yeah, this was fascinating.
Yeah, it was really neat because I was able to get the voices from 1919, from the men who were there, not projecting our attitudes backwards, but what did they say? Fascinating. And so Tolkien was actually quite ordinary in one sense, in that Catholics of that day, the soldiers, came into it with a faith that was pretty well instructed in terms of coming to grips with evil and suffering. That was something that was generally communicated in Catholic teaching and preaching at the time. And so how then do we see Tolkien's own, personal engagement with living out his faith in the trenches? One of them is he does seem to have made an effort to receive communion and go to Mass as and when he could. So we see that Eucharistic devotion continuing. But we also see him, memorizing prayers. We don't know that it dates specifically from the war, but later on he does talk about, he has these memorized prayers. He does say that he memorized the whole canon of the Mass, and that he found that quite useful when he, in difficult circumstances when he couldn't attend Mass. And considering he's advising his son during the Second World War, he is surely thinking back to the First World War.
I think so.
And so he's also memorizing Marian prayers. So we see this as a way that he's bringing these prayers to mind, even when he's in the trenches or he's in the midst of this situation. One of the things he does too is he writes a poem, which is about Mary, and he gives it two titles. One is Consolatrix Afflictorum, and the other is Stella Vespertina. And Consolatrix Afflictorum is a title from the Litany of Loretto, Consoler of the Afflicted. And at first glance, one might assume that Stella Vespertina is as well, but it's not. It's actually Tolkien's sort of adaptation of the Litany of Loretto's title, Stella Matutina. So he takes, the classic title of Mary as Morning Star and makes her Evening Star. And this is too much to go into here, but it ties into his wartime experience in some quite specific ways. And then we end up seeing it in The Lord of the Rings as Arwen being described as the Evening Star.
Right.
So this evening,
and compared with Galadriel, who is the morning. Right?
Exactly. So we have then an example of the way that, for instance, Tolkien's use of Catholic imagery is subtle and nuanced. Marian imagery. It's very easy to look at Galadriel and say, oh, here's a Marian figure. Well, yes, she is. But she's not the only Marian figure. We see then Arwen as another Marian figure, but they're different. Mary as Morning Star, Mary as Evening Star.
Hmm.
So I think attending to details like this helps us get a more nuanced sense of the way that Tolkien is bringing in his Catholic faith into his work. I really hope people reading this book will see that he was a lot more subtle and understated than sometimes we might think.
Well, and I don't know the exact quote, but when he says to somebody at some point that what is noble and beauty in his work, he believes he owes to the Blessed Virgin Mary. That this gives us a more specific or a more general idea of that beyond just the figure of Galadriel is typically who people point to.
Exactly. So, for instance, the Hobbits. I was quite taken aback by realizing it's right there in the letters, but he connects the Hobbits to the virtue of humility. He
Mm,
writes that the Lord of the Rings was designed to be hobbitocentric, and he explicitly says that it's a study of the ennoblement or sanctification of the humble. And of
right.
course, that's an allusion to the Magnificat.
Yes,
Um,
totally.
and so he's connecting Mary and her humility, her, the sort of iconic humility of Mary, to the hobbits. So the hobbits, so Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, they are also Marian figures. Again, we can see that this is much more nuanced and interwoven little threads, not just boom, here's a Marian figure.